So good afternoon. Welcome to this session, one of the last of the day. So this one is about decarbonising the North's hard-to-abate industries for a resilient future. So we're really talking about sectors like steel, cement, refining, chemicals, glass, manufacturing, energy-intensive industries. But they're really foundational to society. They may manufacture the goods and materials we use every day, whether that's for construction, for houses, schools, hospitals, etc. Transport, household goods, manufacture, pharmaceuticals, etc. You need these building blocks that these hard-to-abate industries produce. And demand's only going to increase. Look at the future, energy demand's going to go up, world population's going to go up, and the new technologies we'll probably talk about today to decarbonise will still need these materials, whether that's wind turbines, pipelines, carbon capture plants, sustainable aviation fuel. We will still need these materials. But the North, what we're talking about, is in a unique position to lead this transformation. So our industrial clusters we'll hear about today are already making great progress, and there's some significant projects on the go, but not just in the traditional industrial clusters. There's a lot of other advanced manufacturing centres that are going to drive the energy transition. So I'll be leading this panel. I'm Chris Gilbert. I've had 40 years in the industry, energy-intensive industries, mainly in oil and gas, but the chemicals, power generation, etc. And I've been working the past 5 or 6 years on how to abate energy-intensive industries with some of the technologies. And it is feasible. It is feasible. So joining me on the panel, we've got Dan, Alistair, Rupert, and Kate. So we'll do some introductions. Dan.
Thanks, Chris. So Dan Sadler, I'm Director of Scheme Delivery at the Low Carbon Contracts Company. Over 25 years in the energy industry, and the last, over half of that has been in the energy transition space. So for the last 7 years, I was the Vice President for Equinor, looking after their low carbon solutions portfolio. For those who don't know the Low Carbon Contracts Company, we are the legal counterparty to all the contracts, whether it's renewables, wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, CCS, hydrogen, and we'll also be the counterparty for hydrogen transmission and storage and for sustainable aviation fuel. So effectively, if you've got a project, you'll find yourself sat opposite my team. The other thing the Low Carbon Contracts Company do is we draw down the funding for the levy to fund the contracts for difference. Across the portfolio we have at the moment, that's about $6 billion a year, to put it into perspective. So we're looking forward to the conversation.
Alistair?
Hi there, everybody. Alistair Dale-Job. I am Associate Director at Green Economy. So you might have seen our marketplace downstairs, Marketplace Live. So that's where we support businesses that want to enter or grow within the green tech and services sector. Programs here in Wicker, as well as over in GMCA in Greater Manchester. On my side, I actually advise businesses on energy, water, waste management, recycling, renewable projects, those sorts of things. So the end users, and trying to get them engaged, enthused in the green transition themselves. So I've been doing it for about 25 years or so. More recently, looking at things like carbon as well, carbon accounting, carbon consulting. But more of an industrial perspective, looking at energy efficiencies and moving to a low carbon future in those areas.
Rupert?
Thanks, Chris. I'm Rupert Bull. I'm the CEO and founder of the Disruption House. We are primarily a data and analytics business. We focus on the sustainability and operational resiliency of private companies, of which there are many in the north here. We're launching at Reset Connect North a new service which is aimed at disrupting the energy broker market. Not because brokers are bad, there are some great brokers, but what we found is that many mid-market firms have struggled to find a commercial reason to decarbonize because they don't start by counting their carbon, because carbon's invisible. And so we realized that actually there's probably somewhere between, well, our estimate is 8 and 24 billion of overspend in energy procurement in the sort of UK commercial mid-market firms. And we can use technology to bring transparency and better billing management and procurement. And in doing so, we actually free up capital that goes back into those businesses, which makes them more sustainable, but actually also then can be down payments for investment in solar or PV or battery or other things that actually can bring the return on investment down within the 12-month window, which means suddenly people are much more interested in the economic returns they can get. So I think what we think is different perhaps to some of the ways one thinks about the hard to abate, which is actually getting the carbon out. It's actually about helping people who are can do more but don't know how to start.
Kate.
Thank you. I'm Kate Lloyd. I am a Sector Groups Manager now at CECA, the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. So I'm a civil engineer by profession. I used to work on site for a Tier 1 contracting organisation. I've been in the industry now for 30 years in various roles and various organisations. The Civil Engineering Contractors Association is essentially a trade body for civil engineering contractors. And we have in the region of 350 members, ranging from the big Tier 1 companies that you'll all have heard about, down to small regional SMEs. Our members do, on average, 80%, well, approximately 80% of all civil engineering infrastructure works across the UK. So we've got a huge sort of like remit on our hands, and as such, a huge responsibility in terms of decarbonising the construction sector.
Okay, so start with some questions. So Dan, been on the industrial decarbonisation journey for several years now. Yeah, some regions have made great strides. Yeah, others are still at the starting line, and we've seen some projects ready to go, others fall away, or even cancelled. So from your vantage point, you've been in the industry and now outside. You've got a great perspective. What's the current state of play? Like a report card even, where we're at.
All right, thanks, Chris. So it's interesting, really. I mean, the first thing I'd say is we should celebrate the successes that we've had for the North. So the UK has taken FID on the first CO2 transmission and storage systems in the world, which will come under a regulator monopoly licence, which is the Liverpool Bay CCS system connecting Liverpool and the Northern Endurance Partnership, which will connect Teesside. So those things are in construction, and those are supported by a number of emitter projects over in Liverpool. You've got the Pagewood Cement production facility, which is going to capture its carbon and use that TNS system. You've also got the Protos industrial carbon capture facility, which is an energy from waste facility, which will also capture its CO2. Up in Teesside, you've got Net Zero Teesside, which is a post-combustion power station, world first, that's going to be developed and supported. So we've actually laid the foundations to develop the infrastructure that all industry will need to decarbonise, which is CCS infrastructure, and that's the ones that can't electrify. In terms of the scorecard, Chris, I think you know where I'm going. That the Humber is the region at the moment that is behind the starting line. So Teesside has got the foundational infrastructure to decarbonise. The Liverpool industrial cluster has. The Humber hasn't actually got a firm date on when it will be CCS connected. If you actually take that a step further, you can look at the Peak cluster, which is over in the kind of Dales there, where 40% of UK cement is produced. That's actually not got a very definitive time of when CCS infrastructure will connect to it. So you've got the Humber, the UK's biggest industrial cluster, that doesn't have a very clear strategy for how it decarbonises, and the Peak cluster. You've then got the hydrogen landscape, which is where the UK government are looking to develop a hydrogen transmission and storage system. Hopefully the allocation round for that will start this year with contracts issued via ourselves sometime next year, potentially. There's an opportunity that could be the Humber. It could also be Liverpool. So I think at the moment, the way I'd summarise it is the foundations are there in terms of the business models and the contractual frameworks to make these new industries investable. And we're the only place in the world that's managed that. In terms of how that's spread across the region, at the moment it's a little bit uneven. Liverpool and Teesside, great position. Humber and Peak clusters maybe lagging a little bit more behind.
But positive start.
Overall,
I would say.
pretty positive, yeah.
So, Alistair, so not every hard-to-abate industry is an industrial cluster. Don't have access to carbon capture and hydrogen pipelines or renewable offshore wind. But many are dispersed across the north in advanced manufacturing centres, lots of SMEs as well. So what pathways do they have for decarbonisation? We talked about electrification of heat. Yeah, it's often mentioned. How realistic is that, and what else should they be considering?
Yeah, I think the sort of standard answer is make the best of what you have at the moment. So understanding the efficiency of the systems that they operate in, their focus on reduction for their energy consumption first is always been a focus of ours. But when you look at the way in which companies operate, they tend to focus on what have I got that works well, is reliable enough, and gives me the output that I want. So, for example, high temperature, hot water, steam, medium, dry steam temperatures going into the early 120, 150 degree steam. Those scenarios where you have a large brewery or a dairy, for example, they'll typically be looking to replace like for like because they don't know of the technologies, the high temperature heat pumps that are available today. So it's not always about the carbon capture of a large, very difficult to abate industry. Sometimes it's about understanding the technologies that are available today that are coming online fairly soon, or they're already in the marketplace and have been tried and tested, and getting in front of the right people at the right time when they're making those investment decisions, so they don't make the wrong ones today, because those steam boilers, and I know this from experience of seeing the rating plates on some of the size of them, are probably going to be there for 40 or 50 years. Could be there, for 40, 50 years. So understanding the options and putting together the big business case today to say, yes, that is an expensive piece of kit, and yes, electricity prices are high, but when you've got the ratios are good in some of those scenarios, generating steam for those, as an example, can be done with heat pumps today. It's just getting that message across about the wider business benefits, especially decarbonisation in those networks.
Okay. So Kate, Dan mentioned, we're seeing major low carbon infrastructure projects, getting final investment decisions, going from planning to construction, getting a spade in the ground. It's a huge opportunities for your members, yeah, in terms of jobs and the civil engineering construction sectors. And in the north is where these are going to be. But construction itself is a source of emissions, right? So type of fuel used in the site machinery or the material selected. So what initiatives are going on with your organisation, your members in that area?
Yeah, there's different ways that we can look at this. There's two kind of key areas that we can have that real impact. So the first one would be on the actual projects, the infrastructure that we are building. So we're seeing more and more initiatives coming through, but the key one for us really that's driving decarbonisation is past 2080, so managing carbon in buildings and infrastructure. And this considers the whole value chain of a construction project and really focuses on reducing the carbon emissions and reducing the costs at the same time. So, for example, there was a brilliant example of PAS 2080 up at Low Crosby near Carlisle with their flood risk management scheme that they put in place back in 2022. So Storm Desmond in 2015 flooded 60 of the residents' homes in Low Crosby. And the Environment Agency and Jacobs had the project of how are we going to stop this happening again. And the initial plan was to put a new embankment in place to protect the west side of the village. So the southern and the eastern side were already protected with embankments, and it was going to be, right, we'll build one on the west because that's where the water got in. But then the idea of using PAS 2080 came in. It's sort of like, right, well, how can we look at this from a whole completely different direction. And the decision that they came across, which was then realised by one of our members, Volker Stevin, was to lower 3 kilometres of the existing embankment. So rather counterintuitively, they lowered the embankment, but that was to open up the existing natural floodplain. So rather than the water being directed to where people live, there was a natural floodplain on the other side of the river that was being protected. It was protecting farmland. So ultimately, the solution there resulted, it was completely nature-based solution. No concrete, no steel. It restored 3 kilometres of natural river habitat and afforded a 1 in 200 years protection for 95 properties. So it's not civil engineering in the same way as we've always, thought about it, and we've developed these grey solutions. It's really looking at those green solutions going forward. And it's got the potential of 30,000 tonnes of CO2 sequestered over the next 100 years. So that's one of the ways that the industry can change by actually looking at the projects that we're doing. The other side of that is what our organisations themselves can do to reduce their carbon. So PAS 2080 works for organisations as well. So things like reducing the diesel that we're using on site, as you mentioned, looking at HVO as an opportunity. There's challenges around that, around its sustainability, but it is a sort of stepping stone solution to reducing carbon whilst new technologies come through. We're seeing more and more companies put in renewable energy on their sites. It's very difficult to get grid connection to many of our sites, so that really hampers what we can actually do. But solar panels are an obvious, easy solution. And then doubling that up with battery power and that being potentially using the grid to charge those batteries if we're not getting enough of this gorgeous sunshine that we've got today. But at the same time, that can then regulate the amount of energy and amount of diesel being used on generators using energy management systems. So we're seeing some huge savings, financial and carbon savings, when organisations looking at different ways of doing that. And then it's the materials that we use as well. So reducing the concrete that we're using. We've got MGL Group in the northeast. They've been using ground surveys. So rather than using sonar ground surveys, rather than boreholes to check the soil conditions, so they actually know what the soil makeup is, what the ground makeup is under the foundations, and they can then work with the designers to refine the design and actually reduce the amount of concrete rather than, covering all bases just in case there's a void under the ground. And the other thing that's really coming through strong at the moment is circularity of those materials, is thinking about, if we're replacing something, whether that's a building or infrastructure, it's sort of like there's value in whatever it is that's being taken down, that's being removed, that's being demolished, and trying to stop just seeing that as waste to get rid of, and really sort of saying, well, actually, can we have the steel that's already there on site? Can we get that taken away? Can we get it repurposed and brought back to the same site and be used as the reinforcement? So we've been talking to Seven Steel down in Cardiff about some of the practices that they're doing to try and change the way that things are happening, and reclinker, so using old concrete and creating new cement from old concrete. So there's a huge range of opportunities, but a lot of it is about having the clients that are really trying to drive those changes down the line.
So you're seeing that from the client side, you're getting that pull, or are you seeing that from the contractor side? Or a mixture?
It's a mix, yeah. We've got some real forward-thinking contractors who know that this is the way that they've got to do it. And if they want to stay ahead of the game going forward, this is what they're going to have to do. But if the funding isn't there from the clients, or there isn't the drive from the clients, and too often low cost wins overall, some of these, it's changing a mindset and stop looking at lowest capital cost. And it's saying, right, we need to look at the whole life value of the project,
cycle.
All the way through the life cycle for cost and carbon, yeah.
So Rupert, we talked about large capital projects, but decarbonisation isn't around necessarily around all that. There's it's not around being capital intensive necessarily. So what other tools are there in the toolbox that you're looking at to help industry?
Thanks, Chris. So some of the answers are actually operational changes. So there was a paper published by Stanford University in December where the academics at Stanford had worked with private equity investors in a range of businesses in North America to look at how actually using environmental, social, and governance, so the sort of three pillars of sustainability, could actually deliver better outcomes. And one very interesting case study that I like is where they looked at a North American road transportation business. So if you think about the hard-to-abate industries, glass that you mentioned, glass is energy intensive to make, but it has to be shipped. So there's an awful lot of moving things around. So the supply chain of these big hard-to-abate businesses getting steel to places or wind turbines or whatever. So what this business did was it actually looked at the whole way it delivered the goods to its on behalf of its clients, and they changed the whole approach to being a driver-first policy. So using one of the S pillars, which is not an obvious thing to start with. And what they started doing was paying the drivers differently. So they paid them to go out fully loaded as opposed to deliver the quickest. And so in doing so, although they paid their drivers more money, they actually drove fewer miles because actually they were planning their routes better. In driving fewer miles, there were a number of very positive economic benefits that came to the business. First is they spent less money on diesel, which meant actually they emitted less emissions. So actually by planning better and smart routing effectively, they reduced carbon. They also, because they paid their drivers better, kept more of the drivers. The drivers, because they were driving better, knew the routes, so they had fewer accidents. So fewer accidents meant fewer insurance claims, so the insurance premiums went down. And then because they paid the drivers better, they kept the drivers longer, so they spent less on recruitment. So actually, in all, by changing the operational processes, and I think the sort of economic benefit, it was a reasonably big business, was about $140 million of economic value that change this created for the private equity owners of the business. But actually, that was very large sums of money that had a very positive effect. So I think one thing is you actually don't need to start with decarbonisation per se. You just think about running a business better. What is a more sustainable business? It's a better run business. Secondly, then, I think you can look at using software and other technology to manage better. So one of the benefits of our new solution that we've launched is it enables much better management of energy consumption. So I didn't know until we started this journey 15 months ago actually how energy contracts are structured. And you think you've got a fixed price contract. You haven't got a fixed consumption contract, which means that you agree to consume a certain amount of energy every month. Now, if you go over or under that, and there's any tolerances in your contract, you pay penalties, and you pay penalties in the spot market. Now, in the last few days, energy spot market's gone up by about 50% because of the issues in the Gulf. Now, if you're suddenly paying a penalty in the spot market, you thought you had a fixed price contract. You don't. So if you are a hospitality business or in a building like this where you have many different events, you might say have 10 events a year. Now you think you've got fixed costs. You've got the building, you've got the rates, you've got the staff. So actually if you just run an extra event in another month, that's free money in concept of someone who's thinking about it. But actually, if you're suddenly using a lot more energy to run this event, this is there's lots of lights, there's lots of things going on here, you might suddenly find you're paying a huge premium for the energy to do that. That's ruined your margin. So instead of you actually discounting the last event to get it out the door, actually you shouldn't be discounting it. You should be charging a premium for that. And then actually so I think all these things, if you drive it in an economic sense about reducing costs, driving more revenue, you'll manage what you're using better. So I think the management is a very important bit. And then the last bit is there are some great new technologies coming through. There's one that I particularly like, which is a Canadian company, and they've been developing effectively a way to insert a system in the flue of existing gas boilers. And in doing so, they decarbonize the exhaust that's coming out. I think at the moment they're about 30%, removing CO2. So you don't have to go to carbon capture at this point in time. But interesting enough, the way they do that is through an exothermic reaction. And that exothermic reaction heats the water. So suddenly you need 30% less gas. So some of these industrial units that might be in for 40 years because we haven't yet got hydrogen or renewable energy or other things, actually these technologies are going to be a game changer because you can leave your existing infrastructure in place, you can consume less gas. That's just gone up 50%, yesterday. And, you don't have to go to worry about can the heat pump cope at these levels? So I think there's a range of different things. I think that's what's exciting is we're seeing, actually it's an ecosystem, that there's lots of different options. And I think it's really about information, education, and knowing what's possible.
So we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox. I think that's really the conclusion. So I guess question for Dan. So how's UK industry going to still compete globally? What does a fair playing field look like in the future?
Yeah, so it's difficult. I mean, a lot of people think that the easiest way to decarbonise, your very large, hard-to-abate industries is to increase the carbon tax, but that doesn't really achieve the goal because all it does is offshore your industry to places where it'll probably actually emit more emissions and you'll lose a lot of the jobs. So the challenge is that getting a lot of the big hard-to-abate industries to decarbonise, which typically will require something like CCS or it'll require hydrogen switching, you need to be able to do that in a way that doesn't disproportionately affect the products they're making, because clearly it will have a marginal increase on price. And that's why the government has set in place the frameworks for the low carbon hydrogen agreement, the industrial carbon capture agreement, which are effectively contracts for difference, so that it's not artificially penalising the first companies who install these multi-billion-dollar schemes to decarbonise. Now, is that sustainable? Well, that's very difficult because obviously the money for that has to come from somewhere, and it either comes through a levy, which is on domestic bills, whether it's gas or electric, or it comes from Treasury. Now, the challenge is that until we actually have very strong evidence of a real desire for green products, then industry needs that type of intervention to make the uninvestable investable. And that's why the contract for difference is so important. Not only does it give that investor confidence to do it, but it makes sure that the UK industries stay on a playing field with our wider global counterparties. Now, there's things like CBAM coming in, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Will that help? It might help a bit, but it'll certainly help if there's UK products that actually can decarbonise, because then they won't pay the same type of carbon border adjustment. But it's a big challenge. The other challenge is that you can't get everybody to connect to these systems at once. So the advantage given to the first projects that move, how do you make that comparable to those who haven't had chance yet? So it is a real big challenge for government, and that's why I say initially you have to get the framework, the foundations there, the infrastructure to allow industry to decarbonise, which is CCS systems, hydrogen systems. Then you need the commercial framework to allow the industries to connect. And hopefully over time what you'll see is the subsidy requirement drop out as things like green products create a real impact on the global market. The last thing that you can do, and I don't mean the last thing you can do as it should be last, I mean another thing you can do, which we're seeing already, is incentivising the end user through things like mandates. So the Sustainable Aviation Fuel mandate, for those who don't know, requires airlines to have paid a certain amount of their aviation fuel in effectively a fine. So if you think very simplistically, typically an airline might buy aviation fuel at £1 per litre. The mandate says that for 10% of that in 2030, you'll pay £5 a litre, unless you've got sustainable aviation fuel. So the airline is effectively going to pay a marginal increase in its overall cost, and that marginal increase will justify the infrastructure for those low carbon technologies. So there's different ways of skinning the cat. You can either put subsidy on the front end or you can put mandates on the back end. And this, by the way, I'm talking about for the multi-billion-dollar industry stuff. All the other stuff is super important as well that the guys on the panel have mentioned. But you need some really big stuff because we're trying to decarbonise 400 million tonnes worth of CO2. So, yeah.
I think industry has always been open to change. You know, in my working life, working in the oil industry, that I remember when we took lead out of petrol. Yeah, and that was a big thing. We moved to ultra low sulfur fuels. I remember blending our first biofuels into petrol and diesel. So all these things were done with a mixture of legislation and incentive. I think it's all possible, right? Yeah.
And I think the good thing is, Chris, that we shouldn't underestimate, as much as industry always wants to go faster, and project developers want to go faster, getting the legislation and the frameworks in place and the business models in place and the contracts in place and the project selection process in place to allow it to happen has largely been done in the UK. Nowhere else in the world can say that. So the foundations are there. It's now about slowly keeping going.
Yeah. If I was an SME, and Alistair, I'll ask you this one. So many headwinds now. Every session I've been to today talking about the cost of electricity. Yeah. So why should a small or medium-sized business invest in decarbonisation?
Yeah, I suppose from the perspective of somebody who's been advising businesses to do this for 20 plus years, our usual three questions come up as to why you should do this in any sense. It's to keep clients happy, because they're asking questions about this and they're asking more questions about this. It's to save the planet, possibly that might be a good idea. And then it's to save money, and it depends on who you're speaking to, at what point in the election cycle, let's not politicise it, or who it is that is going to respond best in that business. You use a different variation of those three concepts. For any business, resilience is a phrase we're seeing used even more often these days in terms of, in its truest sense, being able to weather every storm that comes their way. So whether it might well be that they decide to reduce the overall cost of energy they're buying because they're going through a national, local, or even a micro private wire power purchase agreement, so they're getting those very low-cost energy and it's greener, or whether they're looking at installing their own renewable power on their site so that they could go through that process to understand how they can reduce that. The problem I see is the over-optimism of the amount of energy you're going to get from renewable power on a manufacturing site. A warehouse, yes, great, that could give you 70 or 80% of your energy independence from the grid. But when you're talking about manufacturers, even medium-sized ones, it can be as low as 3 or 5%. And when you put those numbers in front of a business, their heart sinks and they go, oh, I thought I was going to be a green manufacturing site. So it's understanding how they tick, what makes them drive forward in the business. Resilience is a great one. If you're talking to an FD, it's going to be down to pounds and pence. How much am I going to have to spend? And what am I going to get back in return from that? So am I going to get some form of a rapid return on this? So LED lighting, brilliant, yeah, great, you're going to get your money back in a year or so, maybe 2 at the worst, and then for solar, something like that, it might be 2 or 3 years. So independence is a really good one. So sort of making yourself like an island, should we say, when we're talking about the other headwinds. It could be risk, so it could be the risk of you not winning that contract or the risk of you not retaining the contract. But it's also people internally. We find this a lot. So some of those businesses are really finding the questions asked of them by the people that want to work for them are now becoming as important. Why are you doing this? Why would I want to work for that business? So if they haven't got plans in this space, they may well be losing out on people, talent, and future talent, and the reputation that goes with it. So it's across the piece is why they should do it. And we're finding it easier to talk their language in a variety of different ways if we use the right trigger points for the right person at the right time.
Rupert, anything to add?
I was having a conversation earlier, and I think that in the current environment, it's important to build on what I said, which is to phrase sustainability in the concept of economic sustainability and being there for the long term. And that presents so many more options to talk about it, because actually then you're having a proper grown-up conversation about risk and rewards. In short, I had a catch-up with the academic who wrote the paper that I mentioned earlier at Stanford University a couple of weeks ago. And he said, do you know what the biggest complaint I've had from investors about this paper is? I said, no. He said, they've all said to me, this is not about ESG. This is about good business practice. And he said, exactly. Right. So I think what's happened, and on the panel in this room before lunch, they were talking about green hushing, because big corporates are afraid of upsetting the big orange man in the White House. In fact, the big orange man in the White House, he cares about economic performance beyond anything else. So actually, this paper was written by a university in California. It was deployed successfully in operations by a Canadian investor, both of whom actually you might say are on the sort of, the traditional sustainability prism of what they care about, which is values-based sustainability. But they phrased it in a way that it was all about economic benefit. And the sort of paper that the UN PRI, who are the sort of responsible investing body, produced with Bain in July last year, found these 17 levers. And they are across environmental, social, and governance. And some of them are exactly that. You keep your staff longer, you recruit better. But actually, if you've got better governance, you have less attacks. The press was warning today that we as business need to look out for Iranian cyber attacks because Iran is lashing out, because it is. Now, actually, if you've got better controls over your business and you have better governance of your data security and things, you're a more resilient business. But that's one of the pillars of ESG. So I think it's about talking about the things that actually are just better business, and we get the values as the exhaust. And I think what happened before we walked into this politicization of sustainability, it was all about leading with values and not about economic return. And now keeping the show on the road is about talking the language of economic return. And you're not compromising, but you're just changing the angle of attack, if you like. And if you lead with, I suppose, preaching, you'll turn an awful lot of people off, because big government, big corporates, they all have understood the value of it. They all talk to each other. So we need to be able to talk outside the echo chamber of those who already believe, and to connect with those who don't believe, but they do believe in long-term survival.
So it's about bringing the public with us and telling that story, where companies who are investing, who are getting government support for investment, I mean, it's got to wash out somewhere, washes out with the taxpayer, to be blunt, right? So how do we bring the public with us? So on a construction site, you're using HVO, that's more expensive than diesel, and then a client may mandate low-carbon cement and low-carbon steel, which is all coming along. That's got to wash out in a house price. So, yeah, how are your companies managing that story?
Yeah, it's for other sides of the construction sector rather than really the civil engineers. But there is a small cost. But I think whatever you do in terms of greening the properties that people are going to live in, the money's going to come back. So we've got to try and, similar to the main civil engineering, we've got to stop people just looking at that initial outlay. It's sort of like, yes, it might be slightly more expensive at the outset, but the returns are going to come over a period of years, and it might be 5 years. It depends what happens with fuel prices. It might be significantly quicker than that. In terms of the low carbon concrete and cement, very, very small proportion of that actually is in your modern houses, really. So you're only looking at, if it was a £30,000 house, you're looking at maybe 3,000 up to £5,000 difference. It's not very much, really. I know it sounds like a lot if you're trying to buy a house, but at the same time, you know, the better design of that house, the better insulation of it, then ultimately it's going to be better. The other things that we could look at is prefabricated homes, you know, creating them in factories, which we tried to do. We've tried a number of times to do, but it's about getting those big house builders to really invest in that and say, no, actually, this is what we're going to do, as opposed to we're building what the people want. The people want the brick houses because that's what they're used to having and that's what they're offered, so that's what they buy. Whereas if we can turn things around and use some, different ways of manufacturing, off-site manufacture, then and size that up and have the support of government and industry to actually size that up and deliver that, then we're in a different place. But it's very, very challenging. It helps in other aspects of the industry, a bit like you were saying as well. You know, it's sort of like that's a safer way of building. You know, you're building in a factory as opposed to on a building site. So there's other ways that it's really going to come off and really support people in the future. So, yeah, swings and roundabouts.
Dan, you want to come in before we go to questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, very big, very deep decarbonisation is going to cost money, right? And you won't necessarily get that back in an energy efficiency on some of the processes that you're going to have to build. What's challenging in terms of bringing the public along, actually, is being able to understand that the value created by the transition maybe is greater than the cost. You know, having low carbon cement will cost more than having not low carbon cement. But the principle is that if you start new industries in our industrial heartland, whether that's sustainable aviation fuel, ammonia production, decarbonised steel, decarbonised cement, decarbonised power, that creates thousands of long-term, well-paid jobs. It also safeguards a lot of the industries that are already there because they gain a competitive advantage of being a low-carbon product. So if you think about the Aberdeen kind of cycle, where obviously oil and gas were found and it basically built the city, in the industrial heartlands, if you can take advantage of this clean revolution in the right way, safeguard jobs and drive inwards investment, that will bring economic prosperity to the region, and that's something everybody should be able to tap into.
Again, I think Aberdeen's was founded on fishing and farming, and moved to oil and gas will transition again. Very quickly, Rupert, before we get to
so I was
questions.
just going to add, I think there's one other thing that we haven't talked about, which is important to talk about, which is sustainable finance. So I was talking to someone the other day, and they had been involved in the the building of Barcelona's new Nou Camp. And that was part financed by a 1.6 billion euro loan that had been arranged with sustainable linked principles. So if the new Nou Camp, I think it's pronounced, was built with low carbon concrete and sustainable steel, then the interest rate on that loan was 6%, and if it wasn't, it was 8%. Now that 2% difference on the 1.6 billion euro loan, I just did bigger maths in my head, is somewhere 35 to 40 million euros. Okay, and when it compounds, so actually, we really talked. It's not that expensive, but actually, if the commissioning organisation looks at sustainable finance, then actually, it can be zero cost, if you like, at the end of the day, in comparison to not doing it that way. So I think transition finance is really, really important. And finance has a big part to play in this going forward.
So it's looking at the whole life cycle from a technical aspect, but also an economic aspect as well, yeah.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so let's go to questions. Got a mic at the front. Anyone has a question? Yeah.
Put my hand up slowly because it's not really a question, more of a comment. But so, Alistair, and this is no criticism because this is the third time I think today I've heard the expression used or something very like it. Let's not politicise this. In my view, absolutely wrong. The markets have not worked to address what we're facing. Governments need to act and need to be called upon to act. So shying away from let's not politicise it, I think is is an omission on all of our parts if that's not what we do. Because I take all the points about explaining to businesses why being sustainable can be good for business, but the system needs some regulation as well, and that needs the issues to be politicised. So my request is, it's not a question, but I'd appreciate your response, is let's not say let's not politicise it, let's say the opposite. Let's politicise it. Governments need to act.
Yeah, I suppose my comment wasn't necessarily let's not make it a headline and a political headline for everybody to view, is not to polarise what is already a very polarised nation, country, globally, on every issue you could think about. If this is the one issue we want to tackle, the way we're going to bring people along is by using a language that resonates with them. So yes, we definitely need to lobby our politicians, absolutely correct, but what we don't want to do is to make it a football that goes between one side and the other from a social point of view, and then you have people disagreeing with it at home. So understanding that it is an imperative. I think somebody used the phrase, I've heard it a lot today as well, I don't believe in climate change. It's not a religion. It's not something that you can either say, oh, I think it might be there or it might not be there. Climate change is happening. There's absolutely no question that's the issue. It's about how we make that real for the person in the street, your friends, relatives, people in the pub, whatever it might be, and making sure that they know that if we change something, it is going to make their life better, cost of living, all of those things. So yes, keep the politics in it from the policy, but maybe from my point of view, I was saying, let's make sure we're all understanding where we're trying to aim and head for.
Dan?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember in the UK, actually, that unlike everywhere else in the world, we have the Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act transcends any sitting party. It was put in place. It used to have an 80% target. It was then changed to net zero. And the reason that's important in the context of this topic, which is decarbonising hard-to-abate industries, is because when it was 80%, there was a phrase to use that was hiding in the 20s. So all this stuff you could ignore. You can't ignore it anymore because that's legislation. And the sitting government, whoever they are, have to formally respond to the Committee on Climate Change, who give independent advice on how to reach net zero. Now, each political party can change their policies in terms of what they may wish to prioritise, and they may not wish to prioritise this stuff, which is a problem for the North in the context of this discussion. I think so first of all, it's important to establish that extremely rock-solid backdrop that nowhere else has. I think the other thing that nobody can get away from at the moment is we've enjoyed 20 years since the Climate Change Act of pretty much consistent cross-party support. And you can see a divergence of that occurring at the moment between the major political parties, all of them, irrespective of your political persuasion. And obviously the fear would be ultimately you can change an act. It's not that easy, but you could change an act. So you're dead right, it is a political issue. We have always had a very solid backdrop of the Climate Change Act. In the context of this, net zero is super important, but actually the divergence in political opinion is a threat to that act in the longer term, depending on where that levels out.
I think it is going to be difficult in the next few years as we get to the next election cycle. You look at the US, what's gone on, but actually in the US, you look at state level, still very strong programs to decarbonise. You look at California, you look at a company like Exxon, and you wouldn't believe Exxon will be one of the biggest carbon capture companies and pipeline merchants all around data centres, which is another topic. But there is still a will, yeah, and some of that is market-driven, some of that is legislation-driven, I would say, yeah. Anyone else in the audience? Doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. Yeah.
Kate said about circular economy. Oh, sorry, suddenly it's worked. I sat up a bit better. I've already had a discussion with Rupert earlier on about this, about economics and things. I work for the University of Manchester. I've had 30 years in mostly the chemicals industry, prior to joining academia, working in sustainability in industry. And I come across lots of academics that have got like genius ideas on the circular economy and what to do with materials. I actually work in a materials institute, which is why I'm interested in that. And then I ask myself, why is none of this coming to fruition and being implemented? You're kind of addressing it from a different point of view. You're looking at it from construction projects point of view, about your clients and the contractors and what's going to make the change, what's going to make it happen. Can I say that after 30 years in industry, I think the thing that would make it happen or start to happen is, I know this might just sound like a wish, but is to make profitable business out of it and systematic business. At the moment, I feel as though the circular economy relies too much on goodwill and somebody who works for Seven Steel who's interested in steel beams. It needs to become systematic, systematized, and have industries, and maybe these are some of these new industries that you're talking about that are going to kind of rejuvenate our northern economies in doing circular economy, recycling materials, but doing it at a profit in a systematic way where if you're doing a building site of some kind and you know you're going to have a certain type of waste, there's a company that you just call them and, you know, Ghostbusters, and they come along and they sort it out because it's their business to do that and because they make money out of it. I'm quite passionate about the fact that that's the way things, unfortunately, do have to go. We have to have people make a living out of it.
Kate, you want to talk about circularity?
Yeah, it's something that we're hearing more and more, and I think it's something that I think my contractors would hold their hands up and say it's not something that we're very good at because we've either not had the opportunity to get involved, not maybe had our eyes opened enough about the potential. We've got some great products that are out there which have stemmed from the circularity side of things. There's an organisation based in Seaham, Low Carbon Materials, which was a startup from Durham University, and they produce a carbon negative aggregate for concrete. So somewhat in a meeting somewhere, they spotted that the amount of plastic waste equaled the amount of aggregate used in concrete or something crazy like that. And they said, right, well, in that case, we'll work something out around that. And it was just an idea that stemmed from there. But, you know, they were one of the runners-up in the Earthshot Prize a couple of, 2 or 3 years ago. And they are now creating aggregate, sort of like carbon negative aggregate, carbon negative aggregate that goes into sort of like the road materials and stuff like that. So, you know, they've really taken that on board. But I was speaking to one of their founders, and she was saying trying to get into the construction industry to talk about it was so difficult. So at my last organisation, we set up an innovation forum so that we could bring people in with those ideas and try and put them in front of contractors. The challenge that the contractors have got is trying to use innovative materials on their sites because there's a risk to that, and the clients don't necessarily want to take that risk on. And you've got to make sure, obviously, that those products are going to be safe in the future. And we are very much around apportioning risk appropriately through construction projects, and that doesn't necessarily happen. So, you know, that's one of the things that we're really driving for. So I think there's that appreciation that it really needs to work more, and the industry is starting to think, actually, this is something that we need to look at. I'm working with a number of organisations at the minute who are looking at what we can do and what we can try. And we've got a sort of like task and finish group that are working on some of those ideas at the moment. And it's not going to be a task and finish group because I don't think there's ever going to be a finish. But we'll keep, you know, seeing what we can do with that, and we're starting those conversations. But it is a challenge, and we've got to try and do what we can around that.
It doesn't seem to be picking me up now. I recognise a lot of what you're saying, and I was involved in defining a project that unfortunately we didn't get it funded last year, where part of the project proposition was that the recycled material, construction material that we manufactured, would be tested in the relevant EN standards as to whether it performed correctly. And I think there needs to be more sort of broad scoping, all-encompassing. I'm from a university, so you're going to think I'm just mad on research, but research programs that can encompass all of the industry interests as well as just the academics making something.
I think part of the problem is not one standard. There's so many companies out there say, I'll calculate your reduction in carbon footprint, but there's no standard that the consumer can trust and see. So you're picking up something in the supermarket or buying a house or whatever, it says it has but it has a X% lower carbon footprint than a standard, yeah.
Actually, Chris, essentially, I was reading a paper over the weekend, which was about the European float glass industry. And I can't remember all the statistics because there were lots of them in it, but it was effectively saying that if you use more recycled glass, actually, it certainly didn't imply that there was any risk to the glass that was produced through that process, but it actually needs a lot less energy intensity to produce the float glass with a higher percentage of recycled glass. So there is a circularity story there. Now, you would expect the European float glass manufacturers to stand behind it with some form of standard, if you like. So therefore, that comes back to a standard. And it was a European paper, and I'm not standing behind it. But I think those sort of things where you have circularity, but it needs a whole system to enable that circularity to happen, because if you're taking glass, you take down the Royal Armouries and you then move that glass to Manchester, you've got to move the glass to Manchester. So, there's a system-wide review that needs to take place, and can you do so and how you do it. But I think it's possible in a way that means that your hard to abate becomes less hard to abate, and therefore it moves on to a carbon parity and cost parity, potentially.
But there's still, with the plate glass, with the float glass process, for instance, the big issue there is contamination of what you're recycling, because the slightest amount of contamination can ruin the float glass. So, sorry, I keep making the case for research, but there needs to be research, but a specific type of research, which is about making it happen in real life.
Okay, nothing else on the floor, so we're running out of time. Let's just go across the panel then. So very quickly, 20, 30 seconds, what would you like to see happen to accelerate decarbonisation of our hard-to-abate industries? Dan.
So I think continue doing what we're doing on the big stuff. I think the Humber needs some sort of clear direction on either CCS or hydrogen in terms of timelines to help safeguard jobs and create new jobs. And then it's about incrementally increasing them systems over time to give us a competitive global advantage.
I'd say, sorry to jump in, I'd say a price reductions on electricity and increases on gas. It's not going to be popular, but there are certain further mechanisms. They've already been done in the current round. And then spread the word. When you've got a good demonstrator site and a really solid business case for something where you've managed to put some technology in, shout about it, let the world know about it, so that you're not the first and last.
Rupert?
So I think the politicians need to hold their ground, I think, as Dan said about the Climate Change Act, because 70% of investment, if you like, that's coming in the tech that is going to solve the problems is coming from the private sector now. Governments have stepped back. They're not providing nearly as much capital as they used to. Private capital will continue to come into it because technology will make the achieving of net zero or post-net zero achievable as long as governments hold their course. And if governments hold their course, private capital will invest in it because there is good money to be made for all the reasons that you said. So I think selling the fact that we are actually nearly at the point where technology is going to solve some of these problems and it's not mission impossible is important, coming back to your point I said about sharing success stories, because I think success breeds success, but unfortunately there aren't enough of those stories being portrayed now, and selling a medium-term answer, it's coming, and energy security, but the politicians do at some point in time have to give money back to people, or they won't believe that there's an end in sight. So I think you've got to design it in such a way that there's a benefit as well as risk sharing.
Okay, Kate?
Yeah, for me, it's and the construction sector as a whole and the built environment, it's bringing carbon in as a fourth KPI. So we talk about time, cost, quality all the time. Carbon needs to be in there as well, because that all will shift the blade. But it's got to be done with the clients and the people who want it as well. You know, that's got to be in there so that the industry can actually do it. But yeah, if we can cement that as being a fourth KPI.
Yeah. Excellent point to end with. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, the panel, and thanks for the audience.